All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Mike Cromer, and I want to welcome all of you who've taken the time to join us this evening for Hillsborough County Medical Association's webinar on retirement planning for physicians. We're happy to offer this two-part webinar sponsored by one of our newest HCMA partners, Jensen and Anderson Wealth Management, and I'll be introducing them as well as our other speakers for the evening in just a moment. Many of you have joined us tonight, maybe shortly after eating dinner, or maybe you're still eating dinner and have your spouse with you. But for one reason or another, you realize what an important topic planning for retirement can be. It's a topic that many of us don't think about or don't want to think about, let alone take the time to plan on. But congratulations to those of you who have joined us tonight and have taken the time and to dedicate over this tonight and next Tuesday night's webinar. We have some very interesting topics to discuss and quite a lineup of speakers. Let me introduce some of them to you. First, we have Mike Jensen, certified financial planner. And Mike has been in practice for over 25 years, I think mostly in the Tampa market. And he's been an adjunct member of the faculty at the University of South Florida School of Medicine for over 20 years. He's a nationally known speaker, has written articles and taught numerous classes on wealth accumulation, planning, and investment management. So Mike, thank you for again partnering up with us and being a speaker tonight.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Next we have Jeff Anderson, also certified financial planner and another founding member of Jensen Anderson Wealth Management. And Jeff uses his experience as a CFP to help physicians achieve their financial goals. He's also a financial educator on staff at some local universities and med schools, and has been teaching retirement planning courses for over 15 years. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Later on, we'll be hearing from Jason Hamblin, a CPA from Hacker, Johnson, Cohen, and Grebe Company here in Tampa. And he joined them in 1998. So he has over 20 years of experience as a CPA. And his main items of responsibility and interest are, of course, tax preparation and planning, accounting, and consulting. Jason, thanks for joining us also.
Thank you, sir.
Last, we have Bill McQueen, founding partner of Legacy Protection Lawyers. And he's an attorney at law and a CPA and a former business owner. And he enjoys webinars like this and also personal consulting to advise and guide professionals in building their business, in estate planning, and asset protection, and other legacy decisions. So thank you, Mr. McQueen, for joining us also.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. So this evening's course, as well as next week's, will be about 2 hours and 15 minutes once we get started. We plan on wrapping up around 9 o'clock each evening, and it depends upon the questions you have. For those of you that are new to webinars, look at the bottom of your screen in the very middle. There's some icons at the very bottom. One says chat. If you want to ask a question that we will then answer at the end of each chapter or each session, each 15 to 30 minute session, please type in your question. I'll look at them and formulate a question at the end of each chapter to whoever was the presenters. So again, we'll wrap it up around 9 o'clock this evening and next Tuesday evening. Depends on how many questions you have. Feel free to ask. Anything that I don't see or may come up to you later on, in some of the handouts that you got prior to this evening that was mailed to you, you'll see the speaker's email address, and feel free to email them during the week if you have some questions of concern. So grab a glass of wine or pull up a chair and tell your wife we're about ready to start, and I will turn it over to you, Mike and Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Cromer.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And welcome, everyone, to this conference. It's a financial conference. We always say that doctors have over 10,000 hours of training before they walk out the door, and zero in finance. One of the things that we've been doing at Morsani for years is trying to help our doctors become educated on the business side. One of the things that we do when we're teaching classes is Jeff and I use a conversation method of teaching. you will see the two of us ask each other questions. We don't always agree, by the way, even when we're in these sessions. But so we think that learning comes from asking a question and hearing the answer. And we ask, almost beg you to do that yourselves. Please ask as many questions as you have, and we will try to answer them at the end of each session. If not, we will get to the answers to you. So please use the conversation method, okay? Jeff, do you want to talk about some of the housekeeping things, please?
Yeah, welcome everybody. In the mail, you've probably received the course books, session 1 and session 2. We'll be covering session 1 tonight. Due to time constraints, we physically couldn't cover every page in the book. So when you look at the slide, you'll see up in the right corner, you see page 1-5. That corresponds to the book page number that we're on. Now we do skip around. We go in order, but we skip certain pages due to time constraints, like I said. So you got the book to follow along with. If you want to follow along the book and the presentation, feel free. The book is an absolutely great resource for financial planning. Everything we covered is in that book. So you now have access to a great library of information with those 2 books that we sent out to you. We also have a folder that we sent. It says Physicians Wealth Planning. Mike and I have a Physicians Wealth Planning group. That's a Jensen Anderson company. So we have Jensen Anderson Wealth Management. We also have Physicians Wealth Planning, which is solely responsible for planning for physicians. And inside that folder, you have bio information. You have a couple handouts that we provided for you that we'll be sharing with you throughout the presentation. You have an evaluation form that you'll turn in at the end if you'd like. Give us a little perspective on how you like the class. And Dr. Cromer brought up questions. We love questions. Questions are always encouraged. And you can utilize the chat functionality for the questions. Now, we also understand that a lot of this stuff is personal because it's financial planning. So we are available via phone call, via email, via Zoom for meetings if you need to. And our contact information is in there. And if you need any information about Jason's presentation or Bill McQueen's presentation, feel free to email us that as well. At the end of the course, Elka will be emailing you all of our information and an evaluation if you'd like to fill that out as well. So with all that said, we're going to get started. The first chapter we're going to cover is life planning for retirement. This is the non-money part of financial planning for retirement. You know, everybody kind of gets caught up in the money part of it, but they don't really plan for the lifestyle aspect or set those lifestyle goals, which are, what do I want to do when I retire? What's that life going to look like when I finally get to retirement? What do I want to do? So with that said, Mike, would you like to take it away on the life planning part?
Yes, and Jeff is right on the point on what he just said. Most people don't do the life planning, and physicians, they're so busy that they don't take time for lifestyle planning, because that's a new phrase that you're going to hear a lot of. You know, they may fund their retirement plans, fully fund them because of people like Jason, the CPAs out there telling them to fully fund their plans, and people like us saying fully fund their plans. So they may fully fund their plans, but they don't do any lifestyle planning at all. So when they get ready to retire, they don't know what to do. It's very common, very common. So they've done everything ready except for what they're going to do once they do retire. Okay? I'd like to begin this tonight's session. I want to tell the tale of 3 physicians. Okay? So the first physician is a newer physician. He's been with, and these are actual cases, by the way. These are all clients of mine. Is a physician who just finished his fellowships, and he's now working at an established practice. Established practice is important because that means they're going to be able to start you probably a little bit with a higher income. Okay, so he's just started there. He's making more money than he thought he would make, and so when we talk to him and he comes in for an interview, he says, "Oh, this is great. Yes, I'm going to do this planning, and I'm going to retire. want them 45, 50, something like maybe 55, but I don't know if I'm going to wait that long. But God, I'm going to retire. Okay? That's the first physician. Very common, very common. Okay? The second doctor, he or she's been in practice maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years. And this is what a person in this situation told me 3 weeks ago. He said that he feels like a slave to others because he's on nights and weekends for many, many years. He says, sure, I don't like call. I don't like weekends. I don't like evenings. But if I retire, what am I going to do all day? Does that sound familiar to anybody out there? And the third doctor is someone who was just laid off by the hospital. He had a private practice and the practice grew, but then as he got older, he moved over to the hospital. Very common, a lot of physicians do this, so they don't have a lot of responsibilities, but he just got laid off because of his age. And then all of a sudden, this physician is scared to death because he's not going to be working as a physician now. Oh, don't worry about the money. I know that he has plenty of money, but he doesn't know what to do now that he's not going to be a doctor anymore. Okay? He is the one that was too busy over the years to take out the time and plan his retirement. So I ask everyone this evening, which one of those three physicians are you? Okay? Now, let's get back to retirement. Retirement is, it's changing. There's the traditional view of retirement. Our parents, for example, they probably all work for one company, or if they're a physician, in one practice all those years, okay? They retire when they're 65 and they receive the comfortable pension. They use their Social Security, and their planning was just monetarily, financially. It's like, do I have enough money to live? And by the way, they retired 65 and they were probably dead by the time they were 75. Times have changed, okay? People are living longer now, okay? And when they live longer, they have to plan for lifestyle. But hold it. We're talking about physicians. This is a conference on physicians this evening. So physicians are different than the average person. They work long hours. By the way, how many times do I hear them say, we got started late in the workforce, and that's because they had all those extra years of education. But you know what? They make a healthy income, okay? They work hard, healthy income. They get into the game of finance later, okay? Their self-image changes. This happens. It changes. All of a sudden, they become the doctor, and they identify themselves as a doctor, just as others do, by the way, okay? Of the things that, one of the things that affect many of them is that as they retire, they will no longer be the doctor. And that scares them to death. So they don't know what to do in retirement because they haven't planned, okay? Then there's also the aspect of their spouse or partner while they're working. See how many can identify with this? Everybody raise their hands. Their spouse or their partner during all the working years are probably saying to him or her that you're working too hard. You got to slow down. Slow down. Don't work as many hours. Slow down. You need to slow down. Just because he or she says that to you while you're in practice doesn't mean when you retire that they want to see you 24/7. There's an old CFP joke, and Jeff was saying, whatever you do, don't tell that old CFP joke. But the old CFP joke is, I saw your wedding vows, and your wedding vows said that you married each other for better or worse, but not for lunch. And that's a problem physicians have. Their spouse is trying to get them to slow down while they're practicing, and then they have to get used to seeing each other all the time. Okay? That's it. Jeff, can you touch on the personal and spouse/partner exercise that we have?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, Mike and I see that all the time where, you know, the spouses aren't on the same page. The physician still wants to work and the partner or spouse is saying, okay, when are you going to give this up? And it can create some conflict sometimes. So to avoid that, and to open up the dialogue about what you really want to achieve in your retirement years and make sure you're on the same page, there's a great exercise to go through in chapter 1. It's the personal partner exercise. And inside that, that's going to start to kind of give you the idea of looking through the lens of retirement and what that looks like. And you should do it individually if you're in a partner situation, and then have a conversation about it. Because this is going to open up that dialogue and make sure that you're on the same page. Because like Mike said, now all of a sudden you're used to working 60, 70 hours, and now all of a sudden you're together for an extra 60 or 70 hours. So you want to make sure you maintain your identity, you do your own things and what's important to you. So that exercise is extremely important to help you paint that picture of what's my retirement going to look like. And there's really a couple of components to that, because if you paint that picture and you manifest that vision, those things will start to come to fruition as you start to approach retirement and you know what you want to do. And it might be, I want to go see the grandkids, or if you're younger, I might want to travel, whatever the case may be. Painting that picture and envisioning what that lifestyle looks like, extremely important. And that's something a CFP can't tell you. That's something that you really have to look internally and say, what do I really want to achieve in those years after I quit my job and move forward and live the golden years, as they call it. So personal partner exercise, chapter 1, extremely important to go through.
If I can make a comment on the personal partner / spouse exercise, you have them there. We're usually have the spouses and they're sitting together, and you can't believe that how they find out for the first time how different their ideas are for retirement, because they've never spoken about it. And it's a riot. It's sad, but it's a riot. So it's important to talk about those things with the people that you care about.
And that leads us to what the new retirement planning process looks like. And that process, number one, you know, before when Mike shared the traditional view, if you only had a plan for 5, 10, 15 years of retirement, not a big deal. But when you're planning for 20, 30, 40 years of retirement because you live longer, that is a big deal. So number one is determining the outcome you want to achieve, which is lifestyle and a financial goal planning. Okay, extremely important, because all those lifestyle goals, they cost money. And then you have to set your financial goal. So number one, very important. Mike, number two?
Educate yourself. Try to be as informed as you possibly can. I said earlier, you get over 10,000 hours of training before you walk out the door and zero in finance. The fact that you're on this meeting this evening says that you are trying to educate yourself. We don't expect you to become CFPs or money managers or CPAs, but you do need to be informed. Jeff?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And you'll be faced with some pretty big decisions as you approach retirement. You really want to make the right choices. The first step is, after you decide what you want to achieve is lifestyle goals, you need to look at where you are now. And that's analyzing your current financial situation. That's in the form of a cash flow statement and a net worth statement. And we're going to talk about that tonight. The first two documents that you really need to have your head around, which is, where am I for assets and liabilities? And then also, how much cash is coming in the house and how much cash is going out the house? Okay, so both very crucial. And that's really the first step in developing a good financial plan.
I agree. So if you're in CPA 101 or CFP 101, the basics are what Jeff just said. The two most critical things you have are your statement of net worth and your cash flow thing. And that is the basis of your financial situation. The next thing, number 4, is develop a financial plan in different scenarios. Not just for health or disability. How does Social Security work with that? And if you don't have a plan, if you don't have one now, you need to do that. What is it? You can't get somewhere without a map. A financial plan covering different scenarios that you have is extremely important. And Jeff, if I can skip ahead and take the next one, something dear to my heart, is that the important thing is to implement the plan. You can have all the advisors you want do plans for you, but if you don't implement the plan, you're not going to be successful. I'm sorry, Jeff, you can get the next one.
Oh, yeah. So you got to develop the plan. Implementation of the plan is crucial. You know, Bill McQueen's going to come up and talk about estate planning here in a minute. If you develop a trust and you don't put the assets in the trust or implement the reason for the trust, then that really didn't do anything by the trust.
Very common.
If your financial plan says I need to save an additional $1,000 a month in order to hit my future retirement goals, well, you need to just set up a forced systematic savings plan to get the money into the account. Extremely important. So implement those goals and objectives. If you need something to get it done, make sure you do it to stay on track. And then Mike, number 6, you know, obviously extremely important.
Yes. You can have a financial plan done by an advisor or a team of advisors, but it is extremely important for you to review that plan every year. I do it every year with clients, sometimes more often in the beginning. But people change. You change. You need to sit down once a year, and your advisor needs to speak to you as though she or he has never met you before, and start all the data gathering again and see if you've changed, risk tolerance or anything else. And every year you sit down very objectively and review your plan and perhaps make some changes. You don't decide to get more risky or less risky in your asset allocation because of an emotional thing going on in the market. When you sit down once a year and review that plan, you're in a very objective situation, unemotional situation, and it gets done properly. Okay? So you need to review your plan over time.
Absolutely. So we covered the new retirement planning process. So that ends chapter 1. Next up, we've got Bill McQueen. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping here. Every chapter is mutually exclusive of the other. So they're all their own content. So what we've done is Bill's going to have his own presentation. We're not going to be following the book on this presentation. So he's going to share his screen in a moment. However, there is chapter 8 is estate planning. So there's another great resource in the book as well. So Bill designed his own presentation for tonight, but there's also chapter 8 in the book. So don't try to follow along in the book. It's not in there, this content. This is Bill's content that he developed. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Bill, if you want to share your screen, and you are ready to go.
Just 1 second. You have my screen up there, Jeff?
Yeah, you just got to create the slideshow.
Okay. We good?
There you go.
You got to display settings and then flip.
Okay. Good now.
You're good now. Yes, sir.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Jeff and Mike have already sort of tantalized you with some of the sexy and exciting stuff as far as planning for your retirement and the great things you're going to be able to do when you aren't as 100% taken up with your medical practices. I get to talk to you about some of the stuff that's not quite as exciting, but hopefully just as important, really preserving that wealth and protecting those assets that you have earned over your practice years so that you can enjoy your retirement, and then make sure that that legacy goes where you want it to once you get to the end of your retirement, and ultimately either have an event of disability or your death. So I'm going to talk to you about estate planning and wealth preservation. When it comes to putting into place an estate plan, what we really are addressing, the two primary things from a foundational estate planning standpoint are what happens to your wealth after your death, and also what happens in the event of your incapacity. As Jeff and Mike have shared already, people nowadays are living much, much longer than what they used to, their life expectancy. And thanks to probably many of you out there on this webinar tonight. Unfortunately, though, the likelihood that you will become incapacitated prior to your death has also gone up quite a bit. And in fact, the statistics are anybody over the age of 65 has about a 70% chance that sometime prior to their death, they will be unable to make medical, financial, legal decisions for themselves. So we want to make sure that we have the right mechanisms in place to handle that for you. Some things that happen from a more advanced estate planning standpoint that I've sort of highlighted and read on this slide are usually of more interest to my physician clients. And that is a good estate plan also puts in place wealth preservation or creditor protection, as well as we deal with tax issues. And so we're going to spend some time touching on that tonight with you as well. Since I only have about 30 minutes with you, we're going to be flying at a fairly high altitude through this presentation, but hopefully we will touch on things that some you'll see that apply specifically to your situation or is of interest to you. And as Jeff mentioned, I'm happy to answer questions if I have time at the end, or also feel free to reach out to me with emails, or we offer complimentary consultation, just like Jeff and Mike said as well. So let's go ahead and get started. From a tax standpoint, from an estate tax standpoint or death tax standpoint, the great thing about being here in Florida is that we have no state estate, gift, or income or inheritance taxes. So once you have retired, if by chance you move to another state, you definitely will want to check with the appropriate professionals there, because there are a number of states throughout the United States that do have state estate and inheritance taxes. And so you will probably have to have your estate plans adjusted to take that into effect if you move somewhere where those taxes are located. So all we're concerned about are federal estate taxes. And the good news is that we're at a high water mark. The amount of wealth someone can have and either give away during their lifetime or give away at death without paying any federal estate taxes this year in 2020 is $11.58 million. So if you're married, you have the ability to give away over $23 million worth of wealth. So most people nowadays, less than 0.1% of the US population has to be concerned about estate taxes. Unfortunately, under the law, this is not a permanent high water mark. It is indexed to inflation and will go up a little bit every year. In fact, they've already announced that next year it'll be $11.7 million if the law stays in place as it currently is. But in 2026, this law sunsets, so the lifetime estate tax threshold actually gets cut in about half. Because it's indexed to inflation, I can't say exactly what that amount will be, but it'll probably be around $6 million per person. So again, a substantial number, but not as much as $11.58 million. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty and concern out there in my professional circles, because there is a possibility that this threshold could go down to even a lower amount as early as next year. We talk about the estate tax thresholds being permanent, the law being permanent, but it's only permanent until Congress decides they want to change it. And at least there's been discussions. Former Vice President Biden's tax proposal plan would reduce this estate tax lifetime exclusion amount down to $3.5 million. So that will put a lot more focus back towards estate taxes if that might happen. But right now, when it comes to estate planning, we really focus more on income tax planning rather than estate taxes. Let's talk about some foundational estate planning. Who should inherit your assets? The good news is you can leave your assets to whoever you want. Unlike a lot of Western European countries where there's a concept known as forced heirship, where if you do have children, they're entitled to a certain portion of your estate, whether you want them to inherit that or not. That's not the case here in Florida or throughout the United States. The only exception to that rule is that if you are legally married at the time of your death here in the state of Florida, your spouse is entitled to basically 30% of the value of your estate or the assets that are in your estate, even though your will or trust may leave those assets to someone else. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later in the presentation when it comes to subsequent marriages in particular. Well, when and how should people inherit your assets? That's where we really want to look at who you want to get your wealth after your death. And a lot of things that come into play there are, the age of your beneficiaries and their financial maturity. And sometimes those don't always go hand in hand. But definitely if you are leaving wealth to grandchildren or minors, that would require a legal guardian to be appointed for them, even though they have natural parents that are alive. And so we would typically set up a trust to do that so we don't have to get the court system involved. But, it's not uncommon for clients to say, my children are very stable and secure, but I really don't want them to come into a large inheritance until maybe they're more up around the age of 30. And so we put things in place to take care of that. We also want to be concerned about if we have certain heirs who are spendthrifts, or maybe they're in an unstable marriage, or they have other needs out there that we can plan for from that standpoint. So the easiest way, or the most simplest, most efficient way to leave assets at your death are just outright distributions. What I often refer to as the I love you will. If you're married, you say, to my spouse who I love very much, I leave everything I have if she or she survives me. And then upon my spouse's death, or if my spouse predeceases me, then I leave everything in equal share to my 3 daughters. But, being efficient is not always being effective. And so usually with almost all of my physician clients in particular, we use trust as a means of passing wealth at our death. And because, again, we're able to put in place mechanisms so that those that might not have the financial management capabilities can be protected. The wealth can be used for their benefit until they reach a certain age, when maybe then they take over. Or we might have certain beneficiaries who are suffering from what I call restricted behaviors. Maybe they have certain addictions or other issues. And if they were to inherit a large amount of money, that might just enable those bad habits that we don't want to have. And then there's good reasons for using trust for tax planning purposes to try to get wealth passed on to the next generation outside of the estate tax system. So as I mentioned, most physician clients use what are called trust or revocable trust or living trust. Those words can all be synonymous. And we use a trust because it allows us to pass our wealth at our death without going through the court system. Some of you may be familiar with the probate court system. Maybe someone else in your family has died and they were using a will as their primary document to pass wealth at their death. And so to retitle assets after somebody's death in that situation, we have to go through the court system to do that. If instead we're using a living trust or a revocable trust to pass your wealth at your death, we don't have to get the court involved. Everything can remain private. The process moves much more quickly, and it saves money, which is probably the biggest benefit people like out of using a revocable trust. It's also more difficult to challenge a trust-based plan versus a will-based plan. And also for those of you that might own real estate in other states, maybe you have a vacation home in North Carolina. If you're using a will to pass your assets following your death, and you own that vacation home up in North Carolina in your individual name, then not only are we going to have a probate down here in Florida, the primary probate administration, we're also going to have to get an attorney involved in North Carolina to handle the probate of that property up there. That's what we call an ancillary probate administration. By using a trust, again, we can avoid that issue because the property in North Carolina would be put in your trust, so the court system doesn't need to get involved after your death. How does a living trust work? It acts as a will substitute. So the identical terms basically that we would put in your will to pass assets, if you're using that as the primary document for your estate plan, would go into this trust document. But unlike a will that has no legal significance until your death, your trust does have legal significance once we create it. You can sort of think of it as a corporation. Technically, it's not an entity, but that's probably the easiest thing to analogize it to. So that allows us to actually retitle assets, the ownership of assets, into this living trust while you're alive. If you are using a living trust as part of your estate plan, you're still going to have a last will and testament. It's what we refer to as a pour over will. And the reason for that is really all that will says is if by chance, when Bill McQueen dies, if he does have assets that are in his individual name, if he did what Jeff referred to in his opening comments, that even though he had a trust, he didn't title his assets into the trust, or he didn't title all of his assets into his trust. This will is out there to make sure those assets go into the trust after my death. Unfortunately, that would require us going through the probate process, so we don't want that to happen. But we want to make sure we have that will out there as basically a backstop. So in case there are any assets in my individual name, they will end up in my trust, and my trust will then dictate what happens to those. You always have a trustee of your trust. That's the person who's in charge of the assets in the trust and follows the terms of the trust. Typically, while the doctor is alive, he or she would be the trustee of their own trust. And that could be analogized to like the president of the corporation. When you create a living trust, you maintain full control over all the assets in the trust during your lifetime. You also have the ability to amend or change the terms of the trust whenever you want to. And because you have such total control over the trust, for income tax purposes, these types of trusts are what we refer to as a grantor trust, which basically means we ignore them for income tax purposes. So while you're alive, this living trust that owns most of your assets or many of your assets will file no tax return, additional tax return. We don't even get a separate taxpayer identification number for it. We just use your Social Security number. And so any taxable income generated by those assets inside this trust will go right on your income tax return, your joint or individual income tax return every year. As I conclude this initial part sort of about the foundational estate planning, I've got a couple of sort of case studies that I sort of think sort of pull in a lot of the aspects that some of my clients face. The first off is a blended family. I would say probably close to 50% of my clients nowadays are blended families, where one or both spouses have been either married and widowed or married and divorced, and they have children from the earlier marriage, and now they bring them all together. Often in these situations, when I meet with these clients, each spouse says, well, you know, we don't know who's going to die first, but which either one of us that might be, we want to make sure that our wealth is there to take care of the surviving spouse for the remainder of his or her life, even if that uses up all of the wealth that we have. But then once that surviving spouse dies, we want that remaining wealth to be divided, let's just say equally, among all 6 of our children in this particular example. Well, one way to do that, again, probably the simplest way, is to say, well, when the first spouse dies, whichever one that is, their will or trust just says, we're going to leave all of our wealth outright to the surviving spouse. The downside of doing that is that then the surviving spouse does own those assets outright and can do anything with those assets that he or she wants. And so somewhere after the death of the first spouse, the surviving spouse might possibly change their mind and change the terms of their will or trust and leave those assets to somebody else. Also, it's not uncommon as the surviving spouse gets older that maybe the surviving spouse will be unduly influenced by somebody who will talk them into changing the terms of their will or trust to leave the assets to someone. And that could even be, in this example of a blended family, their own children who might say, hey, mom or dad, you know, we're your blood children, we're your naturally born children. You should leave more of that wealth to us rather than to your stepsons or your stepdaughters. This can all be avoided, and those overall goals can be achieved of taking care of the surviving spouse by each spouse putting in their estate planning documents that when they die, their wealth goes into a trust for the surviving spouse. The surviving spouse could serve as trustee of that trust, or you could have a third party serve over that, or as co-trustees with the surviving spouse. And basically the trust says that these assets can be used for the benefit of that surviving spouse. But when he or she dies, then the first spouse that died knows with certainty where that wealth is going to go that's remaining there, that a portion of it will go on to their children from their earlier marriage or relationship, and rather than being directed somewhere else because it's locked in from that standpoint. Another common thing that we see more and more nowadays is what I've referred to on this slide as the gray marriage, sort of like the gray divorce. And this could be a couple that's been married for decades, 30, 40, 50 years, and then one of the spouses dies. They have children from that long-term marriage, and they both, unlike the earlier example, have the same goals of, when once both of us have died, we have the same group of children we want these assets to go to. The issue here, though, is if they get married late in life, unless they enter into a premarital agreement with the new spouse, when they die, if they die before their new spouse is entitled to 30% of all the wealth that surviving spouse has at the time of his or her death, because of that spousal elective share I spoke about earlier in the program, where if you die survived by a spouse or legally married, your surviving spouse is entitled to 30% of your wealth. Often in these situations, I see where the late in life marriage, the surviving spouse doesn't get a premarital agreement when they enter into this gray marriage. And often the reason for that is because the new spouse also was probably married before and has children from that earlier marriage and is bringing their own wealth into this marriage. And they say, hey, I'm fine with you leaving all of your wealth to your children from your earlier marriage, because I'm going to leave all my wealth when I die to my children from my earlier marriage as well. So they're both on the same page, so they get married. And then when the surviving spouse dies, unfortunately though, if the new spouse demands that 30%, there's nothing we can do about it. They're definitely entitled to it by law. And in all fairness to the new spouse, in my experience, it's usually not the new spouse that moves or pushes for this spousal elective share 30% amount. It's usually the children of the new spouse that say, hey, mom or dad, you're entitled to that. You should ask for it. And that's usually where this comes about. Well, again, similar to the blended family, if instead the spouses left their wealth to one another in the appropriate type of trust, then the spousal elective share does not apply at all to those assets that are in that trust for the benefit of the surviving spouse during his or her lifetime. And so that if he or she does remarry and then die before the new spouse has no ability to get at the assets in that trust and will go on to their common children once they both die. The last thing that we see much more nowadays is what are called dynasty trusts. And it used to be that it's very common to draft a trust for the next generation where we were holding assets in trust for our children, really to protect them from themselves until they got old enough that they were able to, we hope, be able to manage the wealth on their own, like let's say age 30. So up until that age, we had a trustee that managed the wealth for them, and then when they turned 30, all the wealth went outright to them. Now, under Florida law, we can keep trust in place for a much longer period of time than we used to be able to do it. In fact, for as long as 360 years from the date that you create the trust. Furthermore, because of the estate tax purposes, we're able to put so much wealth into this trust that often now we'll set up these trusts so they stay in effect for the child's entire lifetime. And instead of giving them the wealth at age 30, what we do is we just let them become their own trustee over this trust that you created for them. The reason we do that are twofold. One, creditor and predator protection. If the child ever gets sued anytime during his or her lifetime, the assets in this trust are protected because it's a trust you set up for their benefit. If they get married and divorced, these assets are also protected. Tax reasons, the reason we do it is because when the child dies, the assets in this trust, if there's wealth still left in this trust, no matter what it may have grown to, it will not be subject to estate taxes at their death. So it will pass on estate tax free to the next generation, which is often the grandchildren. And then the same thing could happen when it goes from the grandchildren to the great-grandchildren. This slide right here has a lot of information on it, but it's sort of a summary of asset protection under Florida law. And in the column on the left-hand side, the creditor exempt assets, I'm going to go into more depth on these in the next slide, but these are assets under Florida law that a creditor can't get to no matter how much wealth you have in these particular assets and no matter how much money you may owe them. The structures in the middle are how we use certain planning tools to protect assets that otherwise a creditor might be able to get at. And then the information on the right-hand side of the slide are assets that a creditor could attach if you had a judgment entered against you. So regarding those exempt assets, just to touch quickly on these, here in the state of Florida, your primary residence is your constitutional homestead. And so no matter what the value of your home is, a creditor cannot touch your home, no matter how you have it titled, whether it's in your individual name or joint name with your spouse. And so that's why you'll see a lot of people will put a lot of wealth into their home or have a very nice house because they know it can never be touched by creditors. Retirement accounts, great to have for purposes of your retirement, but it's also a creditor exempt asset, both under federal law and Florida law. So that's why it's so important to fund those retirement accounts to the maximum amount possible.
Amen.
Life insurance. If you have permanent life insurance that has the financial component to it, that has a cash account, the cash surrender value of permanent life insurance, a creditor can't touch that either. Same thing with annuity contracts. So all of these types of things that Jeff and Mike help clients with are great things to have from a wealth preservation standpoint. Under Florida law, if you are a head of household, which means you pay 50% or more of the support for a child or other dependent in your household, then your wages cannot be garnished at all. So, so it's important when you structure your practice that you're actually possibly taking a wage component, a W-2 component, because that cannot be taken by a creditor or garnished if you ever did have a judgment against you. And wage accounts, if you are the head of a household, you're allowed to accumulate up to 6 months worth of wages in an account, and a creditor can't touch that either. Tenancy by the entireties, I'm going to go into a little more depth there, but that's when a husband and wife basically own, or spouses own property in joint name. That's creditor protected. And so it's a very simple and easy way to get creditor protection from just that joint ownership standpoint. And then 529 college saving plans are also creditor protected under Florida law. And so even though you as the physician may remain the owner of that for the benefit of your child, for your grandchildren, for yourself even, that's another way to get wealth that can grow tax exempt and a creditor can't touch if by chance you were ever to get a judgment entered against you. So I'm going to sort of close out my session going over some strategies from sort of a more advanced standpoint of getting asset protection as part of your estate plan. In the simplest way, unfortunately, the only people who can take advantage of this strategy are people that are married, is using tenancy by the entireties property. And so what that is when husband and wife or spouses own property in joint name. And when that is the case, that's called tenancy by the entireties property here in the state of Florida. When either spouse dies, the surviving spouse automatically inherits that asset without going through the probate process or anything. Automatically they get it. All they have to do is take a certified copy of the death certificate down to the bank. The surviving spouse now has 100% of that account, or record that death certificate among the public records if it's real estate. This is different than if you have two non-spouses that are owning property as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. In that example, when the first co-owner dies, the second co-owner also inherits the property. But the difference is joint tenants with rights of survivorship, those non-spouses each are viewed as owning an undivided 50% interest in that asset. So if my brother and I own a piece of property in joint name with rights of survivorship and I get sued, my creditor can come take my 50% ownership of that piece of real estate. That's unlike tenancy by the entireties property, because if they're spouses, each spouse is viewed as owning 100% of that asset. So if only one spouse gets sued, the other spouse is considered to own 100% of that asset as well. So the creditor can't touch that asset. So it's a very quick and easy way to get rock solid creditor protection planning. unfortunately, it does have an Achilles heel or a weakness. And that would be if the physician spouse, let's say, had a malpractice judgment entered against them, and then the non-physician spouse died unexpectedly. If that were to happen, now the physician spouse owns that asset, 100% of it, and the creditor could get at that. We do have a way to avoid that, though. And what it entails is us taking assets that creditors could otherwise get at, putting them into a LLC that's owned by the spouses as tenancy by the entireties, and then creating a trust, oftentimes for children, that's irrevocable, and giving a small portion of that, what we call multi-member limited liability company, to this trust. We do that because if, in the example, the non-physician spouse died unexpectedly, then there's always at least two members or owners of this limited liability company, the surviving physician who has a creditor and this trust. And as a result of that, that creditor can't get at the assets in that limited liability company. All they can do is get what's called a charging order against it. And so that's how we use a backstop in the event that we have a situation where the non-physician spouse were to die unexpectedly. For physicians who might not be married, it's a little more difficult to get creditor protection. But nowadays, what has happened is there are a number of states throughout the United States that we refer to as domestic asset protection trust states. That's what that DAPT stands for. And what these states do, and Florida unfortunately is not one of them, they allow a person to create an irrevocable trust, make themselves a beneficiary of that trust, and move their wealth into that trust. And if it's done well enough ahead of a lawsuit coming, then that creditor cannot get at the assets in that trust later on down the line. The sort of unanswered question out there is if a resident of Florida, a physician here, creates a domestic asset protection trust in one of these states that allow it, like Nevada, for example, and now they get sued here in Florida, can that creditor get at the assets that are in this trust? One way we get around that issue is we can make it what we call a hybrid domestic asset protection trust, where initially the doctor moves wealth into this trust, but he or she is not a beneficiary of the trust. And if the doctor never needs to get at that wealth in that trust, this is sort of their rainy day fund. If they do get sued, then that wealth is still protected out there. But if the clouds are clear and they need to be a beneficiary of this trust at somewhere down the line, we can add them as a beneficiary to this trust because we have provisions in the trust that would allow anybody, by example, that's a descendant of their grandfather, which would include themselves, to be added later on down the line. Another strategy that we do is often create another type of irrevocable trust called a BEDIT, which stands for a Beneficiary Defective Inheritors Trust. And what that is where we get someone else, often the parent or sibling of the physician, to create this irrevocable trust for them and fund it with just a minimal amount of money. That makes this trust what we call a third-party settled trust. And the doctor is the primary beneficiary of this trust. And then as we move forward, rather than making gifts into the trust, the physician would sell assets into the trust. And once those assets are into the trust, they're then protected from that point forward, going forward. Another strategy that is very in the vogue right now, and it has to do not only with giving creditor protection to the people that set up these types of trust, but also estate tax savings. And I mentioned earlier how right now you can give away $11.5 million of wealth without paying any gift tax or estate taxes upon your death. We know, though, that that amount's going to get cut in half in 2026. We also are concerned that it might get lowered even to a lower threshold than that as early as next year. And the IRS, though, has come out and said, if people were to give away their $11.5 million while they're alive and then die somewhere later on down the line when the threshold is much less than that, the government does not have the ability to claw that additional wealth you got out of your estate free of any estate or gift taxes and tax it at the time of your death. So what people are doing right now, and this is a strategy, especially with married couples, they're giving away wealth up to their $11.5 million worth. And what they're doing though, they're not giving it outright to somebody else, but they're creating a trust that we refer to as SLATs, which stands for Spousal Lifetime Access Trust. And what that is an irrevocable trust that, in this example, that the physician would set up for his or her spouse. And then we would have the spouse of the physician set up the same type of trust for the physician. Each of them would gift into it assets up to the $11.5 million. That wealth that are in these trusts then are creditor protected. Creditors can't get at them. But even though they've given the assets away, as long as they remain married and neither one of them dies unexpectedly early on, they still have the use, benefit, and enjoyment of that full amount of wealth that they put into each trust, because each spouse is a beneficiary under the other trust. And furthermore, that wealth that they put into these trusts, even if they appreciate in value over time to a much larger dollar amount, it will never be subject to estate taxes. And right now the estate tax rate is 40 cents on the dollar. So this basically allows this couple to save at least $6.5 million worth of additional wealth that could be passed on to the next generation by saving estate taxes that could be incurred if by chance these thresholds do go down in the future, like we think might be the case. The last strategy I just want to touch on is what are called inter vivos Q-tip marital trust. And in all likelihood, we often will use this strategy if we have clients who have either already used up their lifetime estate tax exclusion amount, or as we go forward, and if that threshold comes down, we'll start to see these trusts used a lot more. These are allowed under Florida law. So these could be Florida-based trusts. And some of us refer to these actually as a backdoor domestic asset protection trust. Because what it is it's a different style of trust. We refer to it as a marital trust, but each spouse could set up a trust like this for the other spouse. And the good thing about these trusts is that even though the physician might set up a trust like this for the benefit of his or her spouse, when his or her spouse dies, the physician can become a beneficiary under that trust. And even though he set it up initially, our state law now says we're going to view it as if the spouse who died was the creator of this trust. So this ongoing trust after the death of the physician's spouse will continue to give the physician creditor protection. And so it can live on through the lifetime of both the spouse and the physician as well. So with that sort of quick overview, again, the goal here with estate planning is to make sure, one, that the legacy that you want to leave is carried out according to the terms that you want to have in place, and that we preserve your wealth till we get all the way to the finish line, and that we protect it in a manner so that you can truly enjoy your retirement and get the maximum benefit out of that, all that wealth that you've earned over your lifetime. So I don't know if I have any time left or not, but again, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any right now. Otherwise, here's my contact information. It'll be supplied to you in the future. And don't hesitate to call me or send me an email or set up a complimentary consultation with me. Thank you.
Actually, you do have a few minutes left in your time if people want to ask some direct questions.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, this is Dr. Cromer. We have Dr. Yankowitz wrote a question on the chat along this topic. And he asked if all of one's or a couple's assets are joint owners, so if all assets are joint, or they have beneficiaries, are trusts needed to avoid probate?
Well, what would happen would be if a couple's assets are all held jointly in the couple's joint names, then we would avoid probate on the first spouse's death, because the surviving spouse would automatically inherit all those assets. We don't have to go through the court system, so there's no probate there. The issue becomes then the surviving spouse needs to do something with regards to those assets. He or she could add a beneficiary to the types of assets that allow us to do that, or they would have to create a trust at that point in time. The only other issue that we run into with jointly held property and avoiding probate is, even though the chances of this happening are very slim, there's always the possibility that the married couple could die in a common disaster or common accident, car accident or a plane accident or something like that while they're out enjoying their retirement years. If that were to happen, then we would have probate involved if what we were using was jointly held property to avoid probate versus using a trust.
Yep, I think you answered that question well. I'm just waiting here to see if anybody else types in any questions concerning this topic. I don't see any. Everybody, you have this contact information available of Mr. McQueen.
Okay. If
Next up, we
there are no more questions on this session, why don't we move on to the CPA? Jason?
I think we got one other question here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, one other question. Is there a limitation on the value of the primary residence for being tax exempt? Or is there no limitation? It can be as costly a residence as there is in the county and it still be tax exempt if it's their primary residence. Is that correct?
Well, actually the homestead, there is no dollar limit on the homestead from a creditor protection standpoint. So you could have the most expensive house in the state of Florida, $100 million home. And if you got a judgment against you, that creditor could not come take that home at all. But your home will be taxed. There is no tax exemption on the value of the home, either from a property tax standpoint. There is that Save Our Homes cap if you've got homestead, as well as the tax exemption amount. And from a estate tax standpoint, as long as the home's below that $11.5 million amount, along with your other assets, then there wouldn't be estate taxes. So.
Please, if anyone has questions, ask them now, please. You got them for free here.
All right, I think we're good.
Okay. All right, then why don't we start with Jason now. And Bill, thank you very, very much for that. You're excellent as usual. And we appreciate your time.
Just a little bit of housekeeping here. This tax section is actually in chapter 3. Well, Jason is just gonna talk about taxes now, and we'll skip it when we get to it in the book. So this is in the book. If you follow along by the upper right corner, you'll see the page number. However, we're not going in order. We stripped out the tax part so Jason can present it now, and then that will be the end of our other presenters other than Mike and myself. So, Jason?
Alrighty. Thanks, guys. Similar to Bill, and Mike and Jeff, we also give free initial consultations as well. So feel free, if there's anything you guys want to discuss privately, to contact us. And I believe either Dr. Cromer or Elka have our contact information. If not, Jeff and Mike both do as well. So
Correct.
Similar to Bill, we're also going to do kind of the 10,000-foot view of taxes, both because obviously it's a very in-depth topic and because we may be looking at some significant changes. Probably we'll be looking at some changes regardless of who gets elected, just because, as you all know, we've had a few things happen this year where, we've spent a little bit of money and we're probably going to at some point have to start thinking about repaying that. So we'll dive right in here. So obviously, as you've probably experienced just in terms of your early career and as you go further in your careers toward retirement, one of the other big roadblocks to retirement, in addition to estate planning, is going to be tax law and using those tax laws to your advantage. Not an extremely exciting topic, but again, most people start to get very interested when we talk about ways that they can legally pay fewer taxes or minimize their taxes in the future, et cetera, as they do affect, as it says here, pretty much almost every aspect of personal finance. One caveat I just like to always issue is Mike and Jeff are think of them as kind of the pilots in your financial, financial flight, so to speak. And, Bill and I would be kind of the co-pilot and navigator and whatnot. In other words, the taxes should never be the primary driving force in anything you do. They should essentially be things that you use to achieve your long-term financial goals and objectives, and not so long-term for that matter as well. So a quick overview of taxes in general. Our tax dollars provide many social benefits, the roads we drive on, government subsidies, government entitlements, what have you. Those are all part of the social benefits provided by our tax dollars. We're not going to debate, at this point, what's good and bad on that, because everything has a good and bad aspect that anybody can point out. Again, tax planning is a critical part of your financial planning, but should not be the primary driver of things. You should never do anything purely because of taxes. It should always be done with the goal of achieving your overall financial objectives. Many financial strategies can be put into place to keep more of what you earn. We're going to talk about some of those things as we go along. And again, as I mentioned before, many of today's tax laws will likely be changed in the future, maybe not the not so distant future as well. And again, here, don't base your entire financial plan on the current tax laws. You've kind of got, what you've really got to do is kind of develop strategies to minimize your tax exposure based on current laws, what you determine to be the most likely scenario for any tax changes, and then also have some strategies in place to kind of hedge your bets should your most likely scenario not pan out, because that's very possible, as we've seen historically. So additional taxes, in addition to our income taxes, became part of the law after the Affordable Care Act was passed. And these are kind of a big thing as the income for taxpayers gets higher, are the ACA tax imposed on single filers over 200,000 and married over 250, which is basically an additional 0.9% hospital insurance tax on wages and self-employment over those threshold amounts of the 200 and 250. Essentially what happens is, or actually I'll go on to the next one, and then also a Medicare contribution tax on net investment income. That Medicare contribution tax is equal to 3.8% of the net investment income over the threshold. And then when you look at the 0.9% hospital insurance tax, when added to the Medicare tax that you're already paying, the 1.45%, and the employer share of that, you get back to the same 3.8%. So essentially it's, one way or the other, whether on wages or investment income over the threshold, you're essentially paying that 3.8% tax toward the Affordable Care Act. And the goals that it's designed to achieve. So just some tax terms as we start to run through this stuff. The first one is your gross income. As the name implies, it's all your income from all your taxable sources before subtracting out any adjustments, deductions, or exemptions. Those adjustments can consist of special items like student loan interest, eligible IRA contributions. It used to be moving expenses. There's the educator expense each year, et cetera, which ultimately are deducted for your income, which ultimately lower your income and determine what sorts of deduction or what sorts of deductions and or credits you qualify for based on your adjusted gross income. That adjusted gross income is the big number that everybody wants to concentrate on when you're applying for a house loan or what have you. And it really does come into play a lot on your income taxes in determining what you qualify for further down the return. Again, your adjusted gross income is all that gross income minus those specified expenses. When you deduct your standard or itemized deductions and your personal and dependent exemptions, which actually don't exist anymore after beginning in 2018, that determines your taxable income. Again, the AGI determines your eligibility for a number of other things, which we'll talk about going forward. So talking about standard versus itemized deduction, taxpayers, with one key exception, get to take the greater of the standard or the itemized deductions each year. And that exception is if you happen to be married filing separately, which happens in some cases, whatever one spouse does, the other spouse has to do. So sometimes one spouse may be stuck with taking what is not their higher deduction between the standard and itemized. So the standard deduction is kind of the give me that the government gives everybody starting out to reduce their taxable income or reduce their gross income to get to their taxable income. It's dependent on your filing status, as you guys probably know, as from filing taxes in the past. For single people, it's single filers, it's $12,400. It doubles for married, and it's right in between for head of household filers. They get adjusted each year, give or take a little bit, depending on the inflationary statistics that come out. So your itemized deductions, which can be taken in place of your standard deductions if you qualify or have enough itemized deductions, are those deductions commonly known as your mortgage interest, your charitable deductions, medical expenses, and your state and local tax deduction. The biggest difference here is that unlike the standard deduction, you have to maintain records to substantiate these in the event you ever get audited. For example, charitable donations. You always want to have contemporaneous documentation, that letter from the charity saying, hey, thanks for your donation. We really appreciate you, blah, blah, blah. Similarly, for your sales tax deduction each year, if you print out your credit card summary, you'll want to keep that because you're not able to go back typically after a period of months and get that information without a big hassle. Your mortgage interest and your real estate taxes, obviously you get something saying you paid those, but that's stuff that's easily, downloaded again, should you ever need it again. But the bottom line is if you take the standard or the itemized deductions, you need to be prepared to substantiate what you take. Back to taxable income. On tax returns, the taxable income, as we mentioned before, is your gross income, less your adjustments, less your standard or itemized deduction, and any other adjustments such as the qualified business income deduction, which we can talk about more later if anybody has any questions on that. And that's basically just the amount on which your federal tax bill is ultimately calculated. You take your taxable income, you go through the tax brackets, and apply those brackets to that income to determine what you owe. Now, tax credits, up to this point, we've talked about items which are tax deductions, which typically yield a benefit at your marginal tax rate. So for example, if you're in the 35% tax rate or marginal tax bracket and you have a $1,000 deduction, that'll yield you a $350 tax benefit. Tax credits, on the other hand, typically are more valuable because they provide a dollar for dollar reduction of federal income tax. For example, the biggest one nowadays is the hybrid vehicle or qualified plug-in hybrid tax credit, which for some cars has been as high as $7,500, and that's a dollar for dollar reduction in your tax bill. So when you go onto Tesla's website previously, now they're over the allotment of cars where they get that, I believe at this point, but previously they would show you the price based on both with or after the tax benefit and before the tax benefit. So it's helpful to know about that. This slide is going to show you the tax brackets for 2020 as the year we're currently in, and we'll kind of touch on tax brackets and marginal rates in a moment. But as you can see, the married filing jointly is typically a wider bracket for each tax bracket, but not exactly twice. Well, actually, I'm sorry, it is twice the single. I was looking at the head of household. But ultimately, as you can see, when you get up to the top tax bracket, 622, 051 and above for married filing jointly versus 518 for single. So there can exist a marriage penalty, so to speak, as you get up into the higher tax brackets. That being said, is there are other factors that kind of balance that out. So talking about the marginal tax rate, that's something that's it's an often misunderstood concept. We've had people come to us and say, hey, my boss is going to give me, wants to give me more money or wants to do this or that, but should I take it because that's going to throw me into a higher tax bracket? And basically what their thought process is, hey, if I make $100,000 and, I go into the next tax bracket, I have enough income that I'm throwing into the next tax bracket that every dollar is going to be taxed at that. And fortunately, that's not the case. The only thing that happens is each dollar, only the dollars that get you into that tax bracket are taxed at that higher rate. Your lower dollars in the lower tax brackets are still taxed at the lower rate. As an example, single person with taxable income of $50,000, first 9875 is taxed at 10%. Everything between 9876 and 4125 will be taxed at 12%. And so just as an example, if somebody was making, 40 grand, they're in the 12% bracket, and all of a sudden they're getting a $10,000 raise to make 50 grand. Well, ultimately, again, not all 50 grand is taxable at 22%, only the portion between the 4126 and the 50,000. And again, that's after taking all your deductions and all of your deductions and adjustments and whatnot. It's not just the 50,000. You don't apply the rates to just your income. It's the income after your adjustments and deductions. So looking at some tax strategies, again, can't say it enough. It's got to be, your strategies have to be developed to achieve your overall financial planning and estate planning goals. And as we'll look at here, it's often advisable to look at your tax planning at least 2 years at a time. And we'll kind of talk about why that might be. And as we go forward here, there's a couple of examples that highlight that. So the first and probably biggest bang for your buck in terms of a tax strategy on ways to save money each year is to participate in your employer-sponsored retirement plan. The biggest reason for that and the biggest reason to max out that is because that money is out of sight, out of mind. It's gone. You save on your taxes. You don't think about it. As Mike and Jeff will tell you, again, that's a forced savings. Contributions are pre-tax in most cases, unless of course you're doing a Roth, a Roth option for that, which again, they can advise you on when that's going to make sense for you. But ultimately, in terms of the traditional 401k, it's pre-tax money, your earnings grow tax deferred, and ultimately the long-term benefits are achieved then when you're taking that money out. You'll have hopefully earnings that have grown over a number of years and not been taxed during that time. So you have that power of compounding in play. In the event you don't have an employer-sponsored plan available, probably the second best option is to contribute to a traditional IRA, in which case, you can go ahead and make not as big a contribution, but up to $6,000 per year for qualified individuals, or $7,000 if you're over age 50, up to 100% of your earned income. So if you only make $5,500 of earned income, you can only do a $5,500 IRA contribution. Again, like a 401k, that's going to provide tax deferred growth, at which point you'll be taking that money out later on as you go along. One key point here is, and this in terms of your overall strategy, is with a Roth 401k or a Roth IRA, if you're in a lower tax bracket, and typically probably the lower half of the tax brackets, a lot of times, you may strongly want to consider doing the Roth alternative or the Roth IRA if you're eligible, because you're going to put that in, and granted, you won't have the tax savings, but your tax savings are going to be minimal in those lower brackets anyway. And in a Roth, either one of those Roth options, what happens is that money then grows over time, and when you take it out, you're not paying tax on any of it at all, which is often, for any of you who own your own practices, an attractive thing if you have any working age children who you might be able to, pay a salary to that's, maybe equal to or less than the standard deduction, have them max out a Roth IRA each year, and that money is deductible to you as the business owner. And then it's truly, that is where you're truly achieving tax-free money at that point, because, the child is not having to take that money out and pay taxes on it. Then you're getting a deduction as a salary. And, again, their tax bracket is zero as long as they're equal to or less than the standard deduction in terms of their earned income. So that's definitely an attractive option there. Your kids may not appreciate it right now because they're going to say, well, why are you having me put this money into an account I can't touch? But later on, when long after you probably don't care and are dead and gone, they'll appreciate it at that point. So another tax strategy is contributing to flexible spending and or health savings accounts. We'll get the flexible spending out of the way first. It's an easy one. The biggest example is for child and dependent care. You can do up to $5,000 in a given year. The key there is just to make sure with flexible spending accounts that you plan carefully so that you either use it by the end of the year, because a lot of those are use it or lose it type arrangements. The other thing you want to make sure of is, especially with dependent care benefits, if you're using that option, is make sure that both spouses are working and have earned income. Otherwise, what you think is a $5,000 basically tax deduction or tax savings, or I'm sorry, tax deduction, which will achieve substantial savings, ends up getting added back into your income, because if both spouses aren't working or have earned income, those benefits add right back into your income. So that's important to think about. The health savings account is an excellent vehicle. A couple of reasons, and I'll name, probably the ancillary benefit is if you never spend any of that money for any reason, you can essentially put away additional money and have that grow tax deferred, similar to an IRA account. And after age 59 and a half, you can take that out and pay tax on it similar to an IRA, but essentially that can grow in addition to an IRA. The other nice benefit is, especially for physicians who typically make a pretty handsome living, is that most of the time you guys guys and gals or ladies aren't in a position where you can deduct your medical expenses due to the 10% of adjusted gross income floor and having to get over the hurdle of itemizing as well. So what the health savings account does is allow you to put away that money that you're going to spend on copays and prescriptions and medical procedures and whatnot, put it away tax-free. And then when you pull it out for those expenses, you're not paying tax on it. So it truly is a medical deduction that way. So I would encourage anybody, especially as you have families, children, et cetera, to, and you have that vehicle available, to go ahead and put the maximum in that that you possibly can, because typically you'll use it. So another tax strategy, this is kind of a one and done instance, is usually considering the tax implications before you determine the point where you want to retire. For example, if you're in a position where you're going to receive severance pay, or you've got your vacation to be paid out, or whatever it is where you're going to get a large lump sum in terms of salary, you may want to decide, hey, rather than retire at December 31, maybe I want to go ahead and retire the first week of January so that you get that paid out. And rather than adding that lump sum to your year's worth of salary, you're in a year there where you've had very little to no salary other than that lump sum that you're getting paid out. And that could be, advantageous by keeping you in a lower tax bracket. Again, it's only for a year, but again, all these strategies are typically, to use a baseball analogy, you want to hit singles and doubles on this stuff and try and get it where you can. A lot of these, you're not going to find those silver bullets traditionally or typically. You're going to want to find things that, when you take them all into account together, that's where they add up to the significant savings. In terms of itemized deductions, and this was typically more advantageous prior to 2018, but there are, some years where you may be able to take advantage of itemized deductions in one year, and then every other year take the standard deduction. And we'll talk about that in a second. But again, the following, as we talked about before, the mortgage interest and points, property taxes, state and local taxes and sales taxes, and your medical and dental expenses, charitable contributions, et cetera. Investment interest, so your margin interest, things like that are typically deductible as well as itemized deductions. The technique I was referring to a moment ago, got ahead of myself, was consolidating deductible expenses into every other year. Might allow you to take advantage of your itemized deductions, and then in opposite years take your standard deductions. So for example, if you're married filing jointly and you've got a $24,800 standard deduction, and your itemized deductions add up to $25,000, well, in that case, you're getting a $200 benefit from your itemized deductions. Conversely, if you said, okay, I'm going to take the standard deduction this year and I'm going to push off my charitable contributions, I'm going to have, into next year where I know I'm going to have a lot of medical and dental work performed, assuming that you can get over the threshold for the medical deduction. So you're going to push those charitable contributions. Then you can maybe go ahead and have a larger benefit because your itemized deductions will be even, over your standard deduction by a much greater amount. Like I said, it gets a little more difficult now because things like your state and local tax deduction, whereas real estate taxes and sales taxes weren't capped in prior years, they're now capped at a $10,000 maximum. So you can't double up on your real estate taxes and your charitable contributions. One other technique, as far as not necessarily, well, I guess it's kind of like doubling up, possibly even more, is to consider doing what's called a donor advised fund. And this may be something down the road or now for that matter, as you guys consider putting away or have available a large amount to put away into a donor advised fund, and you can take a charitable contribution for that in the calendar year that you make the contribution. And then what happens is you can help to direct that donor advised fund to dole out those contributions to the charitable causes that you've named over the next several years. That allows those organizations to kind of balance their budgetary concerns while you're getting that single year large deduction for the charitable contributions. Another thing to do is to consider donating appreciated long-term securities, because what happens there is you get a deduction for the fair market value of the security on the date of the donation, and you don't have to pay the tax on the capital gain. So you can kind of effectively kind of double up on the tax benefit to the extent of the capital gain. Conversely, if you're in the position with a security that's in a losing position where you've got an unrealized loss, you may consider selling that security first, where you take the loss and then you go ahead and donate the cash to charity at that point. It's not quite as good as donating the long-term security with appreciation, but it's still going to be your best strategy at that point. So taking advantage of adjustments in tax credits. Again, those adjustments to tax credits can make a big difference in your tax calculations. We talked about before, student loan interest. That's kind of an iffy one, because usually what happens is when you can deduct it, it's that loan's either in deferment or your income's such that you're in a lower tax bracket. And then when you get to an income level where it would benefit you, by that point you're phased out of the deduction. Traditional deductible IRA, however, that can certainly yield you a nice benefit. If you're in a 35% tax bracket and don't have access to an employer-sponsored plan, that could save you, a little over $2,000 on your taxes, at that $6,000 level. Again, tax credits, child and dependent care credits. If for one reason or another, if you have children in daycare and you're paying them with after-tax dollars, you can take a credit. Typically, it ends up being about 20% of the first $3,000 per child, up to a maximum of 2 children. So what I would tell you there is, if you have the option to do the flexible spending account, putting away the $5,000, typically you're actually going to be better off, because, for example, if you're in a 35-40% bracket or effective bracket, with $5,000, that's going to put you at about a $2,000 savings versus your maximum child dependent care credit at 20%, which would get you to about $1,200. Something to consider there. Education credits can be valuable, assuming that your income is not phasing you out of those. But essentially, the American Opportunity Credit is up to $2,500 per student, typically available for the first 4 years of schooling. And then the Lifetime Learning Credit is tax credit of up to 20% of qualified educational expenses, and that is taken on a maximum of $10,000. So it's a $2,000 credit. The Lifetime Learning Credit's nice because you can take that, as the name implies, for life, assuming you're in school at that point, which hopefully, you get your kids in and out of school in less than a decade. So tax strategies, using capital loss rules to your advantage. And this is actually a big one, especially now, and actually depending on what, especially with 2020, the way it is. Typically with capital losses, which you may or may not be familiar with, is if you have a net capital loss each year, you can take up to a $3,000 net capital loss, and everything in excess of that carries forward to future years. Conversely, let's say you had $100,000 net capital or $100,000 capital gain, and you had a $95,000 capital loss in a given year. Well, you can go ahead and offset those and basically pay tax on a $5,000 net capital gain. What you want to avoid is having that $100,000 net capital gain in 2020 and then incurring that $95,000 capital loss with no capital gains in 2021, because you don't get to carry those losses back. So it's something to consider, and that's why you definitely want to be or be keeping your financial advisors in the conversation as the years go on, and have them, and be talking about things with them so that you can make educated decisions on that. Another thing to be mindful of is the wash sale rule. For selling a security at a loss, you can't buy that same security back within 30 days, or that loss is not allowed. So a strategy to be able to kind of get around that is either to buy into a similar fund or a fund that invests in similar securities, or just to replace that security with a like security if you're determined to not be out of the market for that long. One more tax strategies concerns when to buy and sell mutual funds. Typically, you may want to consider purchasing a mutual fund after the annual distribution of capital gains, so you avoid being taxed on that distribution. Likewise, if you're going to sell the mutual fund, you may want to do that before before they pay out that large dividend before the recording date. And in that way, you can end up paying capital gains or capital gains tax on the gain on sale, hopefully, versus having to pay ordinary income tax on those non-qualifying dividends that are produced from that mutual fund. Another tax strategy is to position assets in different types of accounts. Typically, what you want to do is to position your more tax-efficient investments in taxable accounts and your less tax-efficient investments in tax-deferred accounts. So in other words, basically balancing it out so that you're not, trying to think of the right way to phrase this here. Jeff, you got this. I'm losing my, I just lost my train of thought on that.
Yeah, don't put a municipal bond in a Roth IRA.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, you want to do that so that your tax dollars, thank you for that. It got me back on track there. So that essentially you have your gains, your taxable gains or otherwise taxable gains in those accounts that you're not going to be paying tax on. So your municipal bonds, if you're holding those in, after-tax account or a non-retirement account, as those have interest income, you're not going to be paying tax on the interest income. So the other thing is to always keep in mind any deductions that you potentially stand to lose, that you want to make sure that you, keep track of those so that you don't lose them, and give up a valuable tax benefit. For example, you might have more itemized deductions from a business loss, a bunch of medical expenses or charitable contributions that you can use in a given year, at which point, if you have those, you may have a good opportunity because you've lowered your tax rate or you're in a lower tax rate to consider converting some or all of your traditional IRA to a Roth IRA. I know there was a question in the chat session before for physicians who, when's a good time to consider doing that or converting traditional to a Roth, and that's typically going to be when you're in a lower tax bracket at that point, or for instance, there was a good opportunity earlier in the year when the market basically tanked to take your traditional IRAs and turn around and convert those to Roth IRAs. Again, assuming, with the likelihood of a rebound being high, and that way what happens is you've truly, at that point then, not just deferred, but pretty much eliminated a good portion of your taxes, because once that value rebounds, you're not paying taxes.
Very good.
We cover conversions in the next chapter.
Yep. So absolutely. And that's one thing, when you ask that question again, always keep everybody in the process in the conversation so that, again, because what you're doing there, it has to be in conformance with your goals and objectives. Again, can't stress that enough. So again, the investments, taxable status, we just talked about that, and the types of earnings should be considered when developing your investment strategy and your tax strategy. Let me see. Again, the taxable items are typically going to consist of interest on your bank accounts, loans you make to people, certificates of deposit, non-municipal bonds, that sort of thing. Dividends, again, earnings from typical stocks. A lot of dividends nowadays tend to be qualified dividends, so they're taxed at the long-term capital gains rates, which are lower, which, for reference here, can actually be, depending on the overall tax situation, you actually have a portion of capital gains that can be long-term gains that can be taxed at 0%, then at 10%, and then 15%. So it definitely is something to be mindful of. So capital gains, just going over what they are: an increase in value of a capital asset that makes it higher when you sell it than it was at the purchase price. Again, you're typically there's never really a situation when you're going to pay on that gain until you've sold that asset. And then anything held longer than 12 months or less is taxed at your ordinary income rate. So if you're in the 35% bracket, a short-term capital gain will be taxed at your ordinary rates at 35%. So that's definitely something to consider and be mindful of. If you're holding something for, 11 months and 29 days, you may want to hold it for a couple more days to go ahead and get that capital gains, long-term capital gains treatment, which is preferable. But again, looking at the economics of it first, if you're looking at something and you have an indication that it's going to tank, before you have that opportunity, it may make more sense to take the ordinary income and pay the tax on it. So it's, again, better, even if you're in the 35% bracket or 37% bracket, to have 60 some cents on the dollar than to have, than to pay no tax on no gain at all. So the investment tax rates, again, we were talking here, up to $40,000, it's a 0% tax for single, $80,000 for married, so it doubles. 20% or 15% between the rates there for single, 40 and 441, and then 20% over and above that. The key to remember here, though, is, again, one of the first things we touched on is that ACA tax, which is that 3.8% net investment income tax. That's very important because a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm only going to pay 15% or 20% on those gains. They sell that stuff. They sell those securities and they turn around and do something with that money, whether they pay down their house or, whatever they're going to use it for, and they no longer have the cash there. And then all of a sudden there's another 3.8%. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you're talking about several $100,000 of gain on which 3.8% is applied, it's a big deal. So something to just something to remember and something to take into consideration. Another thing for anybody who happens to own a business, always keep in mind and always talk with your CPA when you're selling assets, because again, things that you might think are going to be taxed at long-term capital gains rates could be taxed at as high as ordinary rates or recaptured at something between long-term and ordinary rates, depending on the depreciation that's been taken or whether you've had assets that you've sold at ordinary losses, which are, it's a 1231 asset, which can then render your gain taxable at ordinary gains if sold within a certain period of time. So again, the investment tax rates we talked about before, qualified interest, royalties, passive income, et cetera, may be subject to that net investment income tax, which is again that 3.8% surcharge that we've talked about before. And that's going to be calculated again, what's called your modified adjusted gross income. But basically it's any investment income left over after that. And typically it's $250 for married taxpayers and $200 for single or head of household. So that's another, call it marriage penalty, if you will, where you're paying, for a married couple, they don't get a double threshold or threshold that's double that of single or head of household filers. Just something to consider in there as well. Accounts with tax advantages. We talked about the tax deferred accounts, the 401ks, also thrift savings plans, 403bs, which are in a lot of hospitals, 457 plans. Then you have 529 plans, et cetera. And the money there, when it's withdrawn, it's usually taxed as ordinary income, unless you're in, a 529 plan where if you use it for qualified expenses, it's not going to be taxable at that time. Tax exempt investments are going to include your municipal bonds, your Roth IRAs, Roth 401k, Roth 403b, which are all kind of variations of the same concept. And again, truly tax exempt is like we talked about before. If you are in a position where you can put away money in that Roth IRA, whether for your kids or if you're in a situation in a given year where your income is going to be zero or at a very small rate or low rate, that's where that money becomes truly tax exempt, because otherwise with the Roth IRA, you're putting it in with after-tax dollars. So real quick, the tax exclusion for home sales gains, which is a big deal here in Florida, probably more so than most other places, is if you sell your home for a profit, you may be eligible to exclude all or a portion of that, up to $250,000 of gains for single filers or $500 for married couples filing jointly. And sometimes that, we all look and we say, well, geez, somebody have $500,000 worth of gain on a property. It's very possible, especially in this market. especially if if you're somebody selling right now, they could very well be in a position of having a $500,000 gain. Two tests you've got to pass in order to have that are the ownership test and the use test. Basically, the ownership test is during the 5 years ending on the date of sale, you've had to own that home for at least 2 years. And during that same period, you have had to use that property as your primary residence for the last 2 years. One key point on that is if you're a married couple, ownership only has to be satisfied by one of the people. The use test has to be satisfied by both. Tax exclusion, again, for home sale gains, the previous sales test. Basically, if you sell another home, it has to be more than 2 years after the date where you excluded gains from the previous house. And here's the point I just made. At least one spouse must pass the ownership test, but both spouses have to have lived in it as their primary residence. And that's something to, something to keep in mind. Your primary residence, that's the one typically, you're going to have your homestead on. That's where your mailing address is going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some planning things for those who own more than 2 houses, but you definitely want to be careful with what you're doing there. You don't want to run afoul of any of those rules, both for the purposes of the exclusion and for homestead purposes as well, because that can cost you a lot of dollars. There are a few situations where if you're forced to move before that 2-year period is up, where you would qualify for the full sales exclusion or gain exclusion, you can still qualify for a partial exclusion. And that is the tax portion. Does anybody have any?
Yes. Once again, if anyone has any questions, please ask them now. You've got a person that is quite informed on this topic.
Okay, Jason, how much tax credit is available for the adoption expense every year?
The adoption expense, that is a good question, because I can tell you in 20 years, you know what, I actually haven't, I will get back to you on that question before while they're speaking on the next section. So
okay.
That's one I will tell you in 22 years, I've actually not had one of those at all. So.
Wow. I think one differences between IRAs can sometimes be confusing. Right off the bat, it looks like a Roth IRA only has the withdrawals are not exempt to tax. Are exempt from being taxed, whereas a traditional IRA is not exempt. How about, is there another kind of IRA, and I think it's the SEP one, if you're self-employed, you can hold out more than $7,000 in a given year?
Yeah, so on a SEP IRA, the way that's going to work is if you are self-employed, either a Schedule C, so a sole proprietorship, or if you have an S corporation where typically you are the only employee, because beyond that it starts to get prohibitively expensive, you can put away up to 25% of your salary in some cases. And for Schedule C, it works out to be 20%. But essentially, it's up to the defined contribution limit. So I believe in 2020, it's up to $57,000, depending on your income. And that's, at that point, it lets you put in more than a traditional IRA. It's going to function, though, similar to traditional IRA, that when you take the money out, all of the distribution is taxable.
Okay.
One thing you got to watch out for is vesting. If you have any other employees, whatever you do for yourself, you have to do for all of your employees, and they're immediately vested. So if I've got 2 other staff, 2 other people on my staff, and I do 20% for myself, I got to do 20% for both of those other employees, and they can walk away immediately with those dollars. So that's why it's a little cost prohibitive for anything other than a sole proprietor, or if you've got maybe a spouse is an employee, or a child is an employee, something like that, it works.
Yeah, and we will be touching on those IRAs and those things afterwards.
Yeah, we're covering all those in Chapter 4.
Right.
Okay, I have another question here. Are distributions or part of a distribution from a 529 plan taxable? Because this gentleman gets a 1099 every year after a distribution, and he ends up paying taxes on it. He did this plan exclusively for college expenses.
So if the 529 proceeds are used for qualified education expenses,
yeah,
then none of that should be taxable.
Yeah, none of it should. Yeah, none of it.
And by the way, the maximum adoption credit's just over $6,000. It was $6,080 for 19. I just don't have the inflation adjusted amount here, but I was just checking on that. And that's considered on maximum adoption expenses of about $14,000. So.
Okay, this about this 529 plan and the distributions, this gentleman did use his distribution exclusively for college expenses. So I guess he's not understanding why he got a 1099 every year.
He
That's-
shouldn't have. If he used them,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, good.
Oh, no. I agree with I agree with you, Mike. Yeah.
Jason, does he still get a 1099? Isn't it up to him to prove that he used it for the college expenses? And,
Yeah. Typically on your return, you would specify, hey, here's my total distribution, and it'll break it out between, it'll show your earnings as well. But typically, as long as you've used for qualified education expenses, that total amount, you shouldn't have to pay tax on any of it. And I'd be more than happy to, again, and no charge, free consultation, take a look at that for you if that's helpful. Whoever's asking that question.
Thank you. That's all the questions for now.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason.
Yes, sir. If anything comes up, you can shoot me a text or whatever, and I'll jump back on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. All right. Now we're back on, Jeff.
Yes, we are.
Okay, whoops. There you go.
All right, we are going to go back to section 2. Section 2, we're going to cover how to build the retirement part of your financial plan, the variables that go into the retirement part of building the financial plan. So with that said, the first topic is inflation. Mike, you want to talk about inflation?
Yes. Inflation. Over the past 28 years, inflation has averaged between 1.7 and 2.4%. So when you're doing any planning, when you wonder, well, I'm going to be retired for the next 40, 50 years, you need to take the account of inflation in, because what you're paying $1 for today, you might be paying $3 for in 11 years. Okay. Inflation will have almost a damning effect on you if you're not prepared for it. Okay. When you have your advisors, or when you run any type of a scenario where you're looking into the years when you're going to be retired, if inflation over the past 28 years has averaged in that amount between 1.7 and 2.4%, you want to run your own inflation, I would say a little bit higher, maybe minimum 3%. And then if it goes up, raise the number that you use. But if you're not prepared for inflation, it's going to deteriorate your buying power. Right, Jeff?
Absolutely. And that's why an annual review is so important, to stay on top of that inflationary number. And you always want to beef that inflationary number up a little bit.
Right.
To be more conservative in nature when you're using that variable. A higher inflation rate above the average means that you're planning for a little worse scenario. Now, inflation becomes a huge issue because people are living longer. A lot of people plan to life expectancy, or they advise you to plan for life expectancy. So somebody age 50, their life as a male, their life expectancy is about 80 years old. Well, life expectancy is an average. That means 50% of people die before and 50% of people live after. So to decrease the risk of longevity, you want to run your financial plan stage 100. All right. In fact, the fastest growing age demographic are people over the age of 100. So when you run your retirement numbers and you look at how much is left in your nest egg at certain ages, you want to make sure that there's money left in that nest egg at age 100 if possible. Okay, because people are living longer. Couple age 65, there's a 90% chance one of you are going to make it to age 90. All right, so the question is which one, but you got to plan for longevity. All right, now inflation plays a big role on that, and let's take a look at some numbers. If you look at a dollar today, 20 years from now, at a 3% inflation rate, you'll see that you need $1.81 to buy the same goods and services.
And that's only 3% inflation rate.
Only 3%. 30 years from now, $2.43. So that's more than double the number. Right? So you need to take that into consideration. So let's take a look at it in terms of actual dollars. $5,000 today, over $12,000 30 years from now. Now, a lot of people say, oh, I could reduce my expenses. I'm going to be retired. I'm not going to be doing as much. No.
That doesn't happen.
That does not happen. Even 30 years from now, $5,000, you need less, that's more than half. And we don't see anybody in retirement saying, oh, I'm going to cut my expenses by half. We don't see them really reducing their expenses at all. And even as you get older, you got healthcare costs and things of that nature. So you need to plan for it. That's the way around this. So there was a question earlier of Mike that came in through the chat that, how much am I going to need for retirement? What do the statistics say that physicians need at retirement? And as we know, that's all over the map. Why don't you touch upon that?
Let me make a comment on this. If you Google these experts, they're going to say that when you retire, you're going to need 75 to 80% of your income when you're retired. That might be great for them to broadcast to people and say things, but in real life, that doesn't happen. I don't know anyone, any of our clients or anyone that wants to reduce their income when they retire. They just don't want to do it. And people say, oh, my expenses are going to be lower. Jeff was right on the money. They aren't necessarily lower because you do more things. You have more time to do things, especially physicians. You don't have time to blow your nose most of the years that you're working, but that's the time that you spend. So don't plan for an 80% income amount or 70% income amount when you retire. Plan for 100%. That way you're safe. Don't play those games.
We're going to talk about what's called a cash flow worksheet that we think is, and we're going to talk about in the next chapter. That's really where you derive your income need from. The lifestyle goals that we talked about, that vision of what you want to accomplish in retirement, you start to work through a worksheet of calculating what am I actually going to be spending when I retire. And that will help assess the number that you really are going to need. Sometimes it's 120% of your current income because you want to travel now. You've been working all this time. Maybe you want to take a few trips a year. Now your income's going to go up. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next chapter and how to get to that number mentally. This chart shows, if I know how much income I need, and let's say I needed $150,000 a year of income. I had 50 coming in from maybe a rental property and a Social Security combined with $50,000 a year. So I needed an additional $100,000 to live off of each year. And let's assume I retired at age 70. We know physicians work longer than the average. So I got 30 years to age 100. So I got a 30-year time horizon. Okay, so how much would I need in my nest egg in order to provide that $100,000 a year of income and give myself that 3% inflationary rate to keep up with inflation? This shows, as you see, $2 million. And that's assuming a 6% rate of return. We think that's a little bit aggressive. You probably should start at 5% in retirement and work down in your plan to make sure that number works. So let's say I needed $250,000 a year. I had 50 coming in from Social Security and pensions. I needed $200,000. So you'd need over $4 million in your nest egg in order to provide income for that next 30 years and give yourself a 3% inflationary raise. Okay. They talk about withdrawal rate a lot in the industry and Mike and I get this question all the time. Guys, I've got $2 million. How much can I safely withdraw out of that account each year and make that money last 30 years and give myself an inflationary raise? There's some new numbers that come out, and there's a study that's out there that they went back every 25-year period in history and said if you took out 4, 5, 6, 7% out of a blended portfolio, how long did that money last? And if we wanted it to last over 25 years, the number came in around 4%. It's really like 3.5% to 4%. So if I need $70,000 a year of income, I would need at least $2 million, and that's at a conservative 3.5% withdrawal rate. Okay, so when you do the math there, you need some substantial assets in order to provide a substantial income. All right, so how do you bring that all together? We're going to share with you what's called a retirement timeline illustration.
Yep. Before I do that, I just want to mention, a number of you may be out there going, Jeff, we're earning a lot more than 4% in our returns. And, so I think you're being too conservative there. These are conservative numbers on purpose. Perhaps long-term, yes, there's a good possibility. Past performance is no guarantee of future returns, but there is possibility you're going to get higher returns. No question about that. It's the fact of risk tolerance. The lower, you don't want to be sitting in front of a TV watching CNN telling them that the market's going down and you're losing money. So it's risk tolerance that makes that. So when Jeff speaks about a 4%, maybe 5% return, that's because you're being conservative. You don't want the other numbers that go against you. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, if you run an 8 or 9% assumed rate of return, you're putting yourself in jeopardy of not attaining that number, particularly if you're 50 years and up. If you're under 50 years old, you've got a long time left before you'll be tapping into those dollars. So you could use maybe a 6 or 7% rate of return as an assumed rate in your plan. After 50, you really don't want to assume a high number, because what happens if you don't hit that number? The whole plan implodes. So the more conservative number that your plan works on, that's really how you build your portfolio based on that your personal benchmark or your personal need.
And he hit it when he said personal. Everyone has their own personal risk tolerance. And that's what it's based on. Your situation in life, but also your risk tolerance.
So what I'm sharing the screen with you now, this handout is in your folder. This is what's called a retirement timeline illustration. We use this to really determine if our clients have enough money in their nest egg to make their money last to age 100. So this was a couple in their 50s. They had a net worth of around $3 million. They were funding their qualified plans, and they had some Social Security. So when the future value need of their income, they wanted $400,000, which is a very lofty income need. But once again, that came from their cash flow worksheet, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. That number can be any number. It is all dependent upon the income that you want to need or you think you need in retirement. And that info is gathered by doing a worksheet, so you understand what your expenses are actually going to be. So this number, remember, this is a future value number. They really only wanted $250,000 in current income, but inflation adjusted 15 years later brought them to $400,000. And when you look at that $396,000 column, they retired at age 67. They needed $396,000 of future value income. That number continuously goes up by 3% a year. The next column where it's 48,000, that was their Social Securities. The difference between those two has to come from their nest egg. They had a future value net worth of $5.6 million. That's kicking off about 5%, which is the $265,000. So the point of this exercise is that they run out of money in 85 years old. That's life expectancy. So that's not good. We want them to run out of money around age 100 because of the numbers we talked about. So the next page kind of tells you what you would need to do in order to hit that objective. Mike?
Correct. So someone will say to me, Mike, well, if I'm having that shortfall, what do we have to do? How much money do we have to put away in order to achieve our goals? And we'll say, well, it depends what rate of return you're going to get. The higher your rate of return, the less money you're going to have to see. Now, when you look at this chart that says achieving your retirement objective, ignore the red column. That's sort of a blended column. I'm not going to get into explaining that. But this is going to show you the miracle of compound interest. The miracle. And remember, your qualified plans are compounded interest growing tax deferred. So if this person has that shortage and they earn 4.74%, watch the difference, the small difference in these rates of return. They earn 4.74%. They have to put away $9,800 a month. If it increases from 4.74 to 5.13, it drops down to $7,000 a month. If they get 5.53%, it drops down to $4,500 a month. If they get up to 5.92%, it drops down to $2,100 a month. If they earn 6.31% long-term, they're fine. So how much do you have to put away for retirement? I don't know. It depends on what rate of return you're going to get. It depends on what your risk tolerance is. But these type of plannings on the chart that Jeff was just going over, you look all the way on the left side of the chart, and that's what you're taking out, all the way on the right side of the chart, and that's what's left over. You know, the important column is that one on the right, what's left over. And this is helped by conservative, not aggressive planning, but something that's going to work and be realistic. Retirement. Jeff?
Yeah, this exercise is something that everybody really needs to have done. Whether there's software embedded in some of your 401k websites. We recommend using a certified financial planner to run these numbers, but there's software available out there. But you understand the variables involved now. A, you need to plan for longevity. You need to plan to at least age 100. B, you need inflation in there. Use at least a 3% inflation rate under current numbers. Okay, so those are the variables that go in here. The rate of return, that depends on your historical returns plus your risk tolerance and how much risk you want to. Do not use a 10% return number in here, because the likelihood of you getting that over the long term is fairly low. And if you don't hit it, then your numbers are going to be a lot less when you get there. So always err on the side of being conservative in these analytics to make sure that you hit that target. You know, 5-6% return should be an easily attainable return with a blended portfolio.
An annual reviewing your complete financial profile every year to follow up on the things that Jeff just said.
All right. Do we have any questions on that chapter? Dr. Cromer?
As I'm waiting for the people to go to the chat line, for those of you who maybe don't see where that is, just put your mouse cursor over the screen and the chat icon will show itself. You know, you mentioned some things that are realistic and what you should plan for, like plan for, 3% inflation, plan for 100% of your yearly income now for when you get to retirement. How realistic is to plan on going to age 100?
Very realistic. Very, very realistic, doctor. And the secret isn't because you started doing this tonight because of this conference. The secret is that you start early, but it is very, very possible. I would say if you have formed good habits, and it's not too late to form good habits, and you're surrounded by good counsel, because remember, this is a teamwork job. You don't need just CFPs and investment people. You need your CPA, you need your attorney. But to answer your question, emphatically, it is extremely possible. It's done all the time. And I'm hard to get like an easy thing said like that. I'm usually on the tough side like that. But to answer your question, doctor, yes, it's extremely realistic.
We're seeing more and more clients refer, because they're taking over their families' estates and their parents are in their 90s. We're seeing more and more of that each day. So we're seeing real life on the street. What's happening is that people are living longer and they're coming in saying, we're now responsible for our parents' assets and they're in their 90s. Can you help us? So we're seeing that a lot. It's out there.
If I can just go back a little bit, doctor, on that. The secret of accumulating wealth is learning how to steal from yourself. It's learning how to steal from yourself. And I believe the CPA and the attorney also mentioned retirement plans. Physicians accumulate their money in two main places. One is their qualified retirement plans. The other could be cash value life insurance. It could be properties, especially buildings. Physicians, I know a bunch of you guys out there own buildings. They love it in buildings. It can be done, but you just need to get a plan and review it all the time. Excuse the incursion.
Okay.
I mean, 80% of our clients are physicians. We've been doing this. It's not our first rodeo. I love physicians, and I'm on the faculty so long. So
Okay. Chapter 3, roadblocks and mistakes. We're just going to talk about some basic roadblocks and mistakes that we see people make as they're approaching retirement or starting to plan for retirement, particularly physicians. So we've got a list here. So number 1, it goes back to defining how you want to live those retirement years, which goes back to lifestyle planning.
can I make a comment here, Jeff?
What's that?
May I please make a comment?
Absolutely.
One of the things you're going to notice right here when we're talking about roadblocks and mistakes is the word don't. It's more the things they don't do than what they do. And that's why forced systematic savings and a good team around you, they're going to prod you to learn to steal from yourself. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, yeah. So number 1 is determining how you want to live your retirement years or your lifestyle planning. And then number 2 is setting financial goals to hit those lifestyle goals. You know, because all those great things you want to do, like play golf, join a country club, buy a boat for fishing, all those things are lifestyle plans, but those also cost money. So that would be number 2, setting financial goals.
Yeah,
Number 3, Mike, you want to talk about that?
Okay. Make a commitment. You know, if you learn to steal from yourselves, if you commit, once it's done, you start to feel good about it. It might hurt in the early years, but once you do it, if you make a commitment to be financially successful and you're wise and you have counsel, good counsel there, it'll work. But you have to make the commitment to be financially successful. And if I'm going to go to the next one, Jeff, and it says, they don't educate themselves. Well, you know what? The people on this call and this Zoom tonight are not the ones who don't educate themselves. You are so far ahead of the game, especially amongst physicians. No matter what you think the physicians have, you know, they may have the nice house or the nice car. They don't necessarily have the good retirement numbers. We see it, you know, we see both sides of that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, we're going to talk about taking an inventory here in a minute. We're going to talk about credit, but a big one is seeking professional assistance and kind of forming a team approach to your financial planning. A good CPA, a good attorney, and a good certified financial planner that all works collaboratively together for the betterment of your overall financial profile makes a lot of sense. So getting a team together who can share ideas with each other is something that really works. That's kind of why we have a panel of a CPA and a state attorney and CFPs tonight, as you can kind of see how they all kind of relate to each other, and you need a collaborative effort to get the job done effectively. Mike, number 4, you talked about that again, which is pay yourself first.
It's this, forced systematic savings. Finance 101, Jeff just said it, pay yourself first. Don't do it where you have to make a decision every month of whether you're going to put money into some type of investment account. Have it done automatically, whether it's your qualified plans, 403Bs or whatever, or your private savings. Do it as an automatic draft. And we should have entitled this tonight, complete, don't forget to fully fund your retirement plans at work. It's stealing. Because it's done on a regular basis, stealing from yourself. And that's the way you have to do it. You have to blindfold yourself and do it automatically. Good.
You can kind of see how, you know, when you looked at that retirement timeline analysis and that save more, earn more piece, let's say it says that you needed to save an additional $2,000 a month. Don't wait to the end of the year and try to fund the $24,000 in the plan, because a lot of times you don't have it. Take that out on a monthly forced systematic savings. On the 1st of the month, the 15th of the month, the investment firm will be more than happy to take your money on a systematic contribution, and you get the money into the account. Even if you've maxed out all your retirement accounts, start funding just a non-qualified brokerage.
Yeah, even non-qualified. Good point.
Get the money
Jeff.
in the accounts, and that's it. All right. Tax laws number 5, we already talked about that. So we'll move on to number 6. This is a big one. Asset allocation. Mike?
Oh, let me handle this. Since we're speaking to a group of physicians tonight, as we usually are, by the way, there's a Nobel Prize awarded to 2 doctors. Thank God they were PhDs from Northwestern University, Doctors Bierbauer and Brinson. And their Nobel Prize was based on the fact that when it comes to an overall investment portfolio, you all have an overall investment portfolio. When it comes to that, the total growth of those assets in there, over 91% of the growth in that portfolio is not when you bought the stock, is not, or bond, is not when you sold the stock or bond. The biggest reason isn't even what the market's doing. The 91% of the growth in an overall portfolio comes from asset allocation. Because people like us, we talk a good game. We act like, oh, we got all these letters behind our name. We know all this stuff. The only thing we really know is that this year, it might be large cap US domestic stock up here, and they might be down here next year. Or the next year it might be tech, and tech could be up here and that could be down here. All that we know is that every year there's a different asset class that's probably going to be up the top. And if your asset allocation is proper, it saves you so much heartache and so much loss. That is a huge thing, asset allocation.
There's also another component to that, which is the portfolio rebalancing.
Correct.
So let's say I've designed my portfolio based on my risk profile, and I have 60% in stocks and 40% in fixed income. Well, if in this past year, and recently, you've seen some run up in the equities. So you might be at a 70-30 now, and if the market corrects, you've got 70% exposed. So to rebalance, at least annually, you would sell off some of those winners, buy back some of the stability, and keep yourself at that 60-40 asset allocation that correlates to your risk profile. Okay, so design your asset allocation and then rebalance at least annually. Number 7, planning for the unexpected. That's just the what if scenarios. What if I died? What if I become disabled, which is a big one for physicians? Or what if I got sick? Would my family be able to live in the same economic lifestyle they've been accustomed to? We cover this extensively in the risk management chapter, which will be next week. We'll go over how to protect that nest egg, because when you're approaching retirement, you probably have the most amount of money you've ever had, and you need to protect that from all these different variables that could kind of grenade that whole nest egg and throw you off course for retirement. Number 8, Mike, let's fully fund your retirement plans. I think we
got that message across tonight. How about we skip that one, and I'll touch on 9 and maybe 10.
Yeah.
But the tax laws on the inheritance tax and the estate tax are very favorable right now, as the attorney and the CPA referred to this evening. But that's even no matter who wins the election, in time, those rates are probably going to come back up, and the estate taxes. So make sure you plan for your proper estate tax, because that's going to be money that you're taxed on after you've paid money. You paid you paid tax on all the dollars that one way or the other that you've accumulated over your life. You've already paid taxes on them, but the estate tax will take away additional money on money you've already paid taxes on. And I want to finish with, don't create a financial plan. That is the most important thing, to make sure that you, and we've said this before, make sure you have a financial plan, and don't do it by yourself. Have a professional do it. And then once you do it, review it every year, because we all change every year. It's like, if I can do something for my own benefit here, the other thing I beg you to do every year is read your wills and trust, because we change. So read that also. But create a financial plan, update it, and follow it. All right, Jeff.
Yep, we're on to net worth and cash flow.
The 2 basic statements in Finance 101. They are the most of the makeup of all financial monitoring. The net worth statement, and by the way, remind me on the cash flow statement to tell you to look out for such a terrible person that Jeff is on doing financial cash flow statement. But your statement of net worth, you need to do that. What do I own? What do I owe? What's left over? Cash flow, how much money comes in? What really goes out? And what's left over?
So in your net worth statement, that's something that you should have readily available. There are all kinds of aggregation tools out there that you may have seen in the marketplace. And what that is that it's a portal that will go out to all of your accounts and link them for you. So you have one hub where you can see your net worth statement as a live, living document. We strongly encourage you that you get involved with that. And once you link them all together, because as we know, if you want to check all your accounts, you got to log into 6 different websites. It's a real big pain. So there's all these aggregation portals out there. We use one in our practice. Mint.com, I believe, is one that you can utilize for free. And a lot of the banks are using them now as well. So that kind of helps keep you informed of your assets, liabilities, and the differences, what's called your net worth. Your cash flow statement, we've been talking about this. This is an extremely important document. We have an example of one in your folder. We can email the cash flow worksheet to you. It's an Excel format. And we strongly encourage you to do 2 versions. You do one now, and that is to track the money that's coming in and where am I spending all my money. As a physician, your expenses will start to mount as you start to make more money, and you want to make sure that you're not living beyond your means. So you want to track that. It's also important that if I need to save additional money to hit my retirement income goals down the road, where am I going to get that money from? What's my positive cash flow on a monthly basis? And if I don't have a lot of positive cash flow, where am I spending my money? And maybe I can reduce those costs to try to get more positive cash flow to contribute to my plan. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is now we talked about lifestyle planning. Do one as if you're retired and what that looks like. You know, Mike had talked about people using 80%. We don't believe in that. You really need to know what you think you're really going to spend when you're in retirement. And the isolation of the 2 variables in that number is fixed and discretionary spending. I want to know currently what my expenses are that feeds my family and keeps me in my home. Discretionary or fund money, I can control that variable, right? That's a number I can control. When I retire, I also want to know that number. What are my fixed costs? Because if I could get that covered by some form of guaranteed income, that would be great. I don't have to worry about the market fluctuation. If I'm concerned about that, I may only take 1 vacation instead of 3, or whatever the case may be. So I want to know what my fixed costs are and my discretionary spending. I want to know what my expenses are now. I also want to do a pro forma for a future value of what I think my expenses will be when I retire. Extremely important document. We can't stress enough that you get that done.
Yes, the cash flow statement. When we're dealing with these, reviewing things for our clients, the cash flow statement, we say, we'll go to a client. Well, you told us that this much money comes in, right? Right. And this much money goes out. That's the amount of money you're spending now, right? Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And this is how much is left over, right? And they go, huh? Because people tend to overestimate their income and underestimate their expenses. So you need to get a handle on what your expenses are. And I hate to compliment Jeff in front of all these people, but he started me on a habit that I hated him for the first 2 or 3 years. And that is doing an exact cash flow statement of expenses and your income. I hate it. But by the way, we don't tell our clients or suggest our clients, go and do this and go and do that. And then Jensen or Jeff, we run out somewhere else and we don't do all that stuff. We do all this stuff. So that's why I'm admitting when I do my annual review, I do this worksheet. And the worksheet that Jeff, I should condemn him for this, but he's the one that really put this together. And it just breaks down everything. And you know what? There's no fooling yourself after you do it. Take your time and do it. And to be honest with you, I'm doing mine right now. and I've had it for a week laying in my office, and I carry it home with me, everything. I'm still not done it. And it's a week because I hate doing it. But I can tell you, I'm almost done it. When I'm done it, I know what I'm spending. I know what I'm making. I can't lie to myself. So it's so important for you to do that. It's so important to really know what you need to live.
So I hope that answered the previous question on, what's the average that a physician needs for income? There really is no average. It really is purely, because we see, a lot of physicians who spend way too much than they should be, and then a lot of physicians who are spending within their means. So if it's predicated upon that, you really can't do an average. It's really, what are you spending on an annual basis, and what does it going to look like when you retire? This is a big one. Mike, you want to talk about debt?
Debt?
Yeah.
Oh, debt. Let's see. I don't think physicians know that much money about debt. You folks don't go into debt much at all, do you? Maybe 500,000, something like that. Today, our average, we have a lot of young physicians also come to us, and they come out and they all walk out with about $400,000 or $500,000 in debt. I don't know what it was for you or whether you're still paying yours off. But also, we have the regional director for Sally Mae come in and speak to our residents and fellows, and she's head of the entire Southeast. And she comes in, and so here's, especially with our residents and fellows, they're all like in debt, like up to here. And we just tell them, don't be afraid of it, because I know the people out here, most of you that are listening to me, you've paid it all off already. And she says that physicians pay off their debts faster than anyone. And what happens is they're scared to death. They think that they're the only one that's got 400,000 or 500,000 or more in debt. They think they're the only one. They don't, and we tell them, hey, you're just one of the crowd. But what happens is their income jumps so much, and if they attack it from the beginning and they do it properly, and literally we can put them on the phone with the people from Sally Mae in the medical loan department. If they pay it off systematically, it works. And you know what? That debt is good debt. That is your education. And we have ways to help you pay that off. Okay? That's good debt. But there's bad debt also. I had a client come in. Well, he's been a client about a year. He's just finished. He's in a good practice, almost like the example I was giving. Good practice. And he comes back for his annual review, and he says, well, he says, yeah, there's some changes. Yeah, I bought a house for $750,000. I'm living over the water, over in Pinellas, and I bought a boat. And I'm thinking, oh my God. Oh, excuse me. Oh my gosh. But, so we had a long talk, and he started the wrong way. That's bad debt. The big joke amongst the residents and fellows is, well, and then when they graduate, they go, well, now I'm an attending, I'm an attending now. So now I have to get that big car and that home. Don't fall for that. That's bad debt. So debt is there. You have to be wise with it. But believe me, you will make enough money to pay it off if you form good habits. Even if you've made mistakes in the past, it's easy to reform and pay off debt.
This is extremely important as far as living within your means. Bankers love physicians because they're they'll extend them a lot of debt. And if you come out of the gates and you walk into this big house, you buy yourself a fancy car, it's very difficult to go backwards once you get up to that level. And now you've got these huge expenses. All your money's going into these big $1 million homes in the Ferrari payment and keeping up with the Joneses. It's very difficult to sell that off and go backwards.
I'm going to interrupt again. Excuse me. That young doctor bought the home for $750,000. I said, how'd you do it? He says, Mike, they said they had this is a quote. They said they had a doctor's plan. Zero down. How the heck can they? That's criminal that they did that to that young guy. I'm sorry, Jeff. Go ahead.
Yep, no problem. So the one piece of advice we can give you is really make sure before you get into these big purchases that you do the math. You know, we get that now all of a sudden you, particularly if you're a younger physician, now all of a sudden you're making a lot of money for the first time and it feels real good. But there's a reason why 80% of athletes go broke and 80% of lottery winners go broke, because they get in over their heads. With physicians, all of a sudden you've got this money and it feels real good, but make sure you don't get in over your head. The best advice we can really give you is don't do that. We've got a lot of clients who have substantially high net worths, and there's a common thread there. They all make it around the same amount of money, but the ones with the big homes and the fancy cars have a much less net worth at retirement than the ones who live within their means. We're talking tens of millions of dollars difference of somebody who made the exact same amount of money. So as enticing as it is, and those banks will give you those loans because they know you're going to pay it back, or else they'll extend it to you. But you know, all your money's going towards your house, and that's a scary thing. Anything else on that one, Mike?
That's it, Mr. Anderson.
Well, we're at section 4, and it's 8:57. So
I say, well, the meeting has to end at 9 o'clock, and 8:57 is 9 o'clock to me. Are there any questions of the doctor there? Oh, we can't hear.
Sorry about that.
no problem.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
Someone asked a question about what we had heard from the attorney, and that's concerning the estate tax limit sunsets in 2016. I'm not sure if Bill's still.
no, not
Okay.
2016.
2026 is what the
Correct.
question says. Okay.
Correct.
Then if Biden were to win, are the new limits effective immediately in 2021? And if that's the case, if I were to create a slat, do I form it before the end of 2020?
Well, it depends who wins Congress. That's a huge part of it, because that's where a lot of the legislation comes from. And the answer is yes, it could change next year. They can change it.
They can retroactively change it to January 1? Okay.
Yes,
I would also email Bill on that one, just so
Yeah,
he'll give you a
that's-
little bit more of a breakdown on that.
right.
Yeah.
Also, and I know the CPA is not here also, there was a question earlier about the adoption allowance for a tax credit. How about dependent allowance for those who may be taking care of their elderly parents, whether they're living with them or paying their bills? Is there a limit on that, and what needs to be kept track of? Any
Yeah,
comments along those lines?
We got to get the CPA to answer what the limits are and the amounts on that.
Yeah, we know that answer, but we kind of shy away from giving that
Yeah,
any type of advice.
We're not, so just email us the question and we'll get it to Jason, or write to Jason, because Jason, just email him.
Okay, yeah, we have his contact.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. So next week, we've got a lot of stuff to cover. So we have, we're going to be covering risk management, which is life insurance, disability, all that, which is very important. We have the investment chapter, which is how do investments work? What investment should I be looking at going forward? We have Social Security. Yeah, we have Social Security, which is always a hot one.
Yeah, that's,
And then we have distributions, which is how to execute a rollover. If I have a pension plan, what are my choices and how do I execute a pension distribution? A required minimum distributions we cover in that chapter. So we've got a full
we cover pretty heavily in there also.
class next week as well. So I think we did see one other question come through.
Any strategies for doctors and disability? But I think we're going to be covering disability next
Yes.
week. Any
Yes.
strategies?
That's something we deal with every day, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay,
Every day.
lots
So
of experience on that.
Yeah, we'll get all that stuff next week.
Okay, gentlemen, it's 9 o'clock by my watch. We'll see you next Tuesday night at 6:30, as well as the rest of our attendees who care to join us. We'll see you
Okay.
next
Thank
week.
you. Be
everyone.
safe, everybody, and thank you.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Have a
Good
good
night.
night. Bye.